We're really thrilled to have Anthony with us to celebrate the retrospective, which spans his 45-year career. And I want to ask him some questions. We're going to go through some of the pictures in the exhibition and give him a chance to give us a behind the scenes into the making of the pictures and some ideas that traverse his entire career. And then at the end, I'm going to save some time, so if you have questions, you can ask them as well. So, you grew up in Los Angeles, but you didn't grow up going to museums. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how you became interested in art and why specifically photography was something that you were drawn to.
Okay, well, I have to cut a long story short. Actually, I got into photography, you might say it was an accident. I had no idea growing up. I never went to a museum. I didn't have any background in terms of art at all. But a friend of mine gave me a book. It was about photography, a handbook that he found in a bathroom, actually. And I thought then, because I was still in high school, just about to get out of high school, what am I going to do? Because I had no plans. And so I thought, well, I would go to this junior college and take these photography classes. And maybe I had this crazy idea that maybe I could become a fashion photographer, meaning money and women. But anyway, it didn't turn out that way. I didn't know anything about photography, but I discovered right away, actually, Edward Weston's work. And if you know Edward Weston's work, well, that was a big deal in terms of transforming the idea of photography. It wasn't fashion, it was art. And so at that point I decided I wanted to make pictures like Edward Weston. I don't mean his particular subject matter, but Weston's way of looking at the world. I thought of that clarity, that vision, and I always thought of him, not at the moment, but later, that he was really a visionary. And so Edward Weston is the first inspiration, and then that led into, you might say, discovering photography, other photographers, the history of photography, and then that led into learning about painting, sculpture, art in general, and that was the beginning of, you might say, my education in art in general, so to speak. But I had no experience. I had never been to a museum. I'd never seen an exhibition of photographs or anything. So it was just starting from scratch, you might say.
And one of the things that I find really interesting is that after you were drafted and went to Vietnam acting as a medic, your aunt sent you a subscription to Art Forum. And so one of your experiences was paging through this art magazine while you were in Vietnam.
Right. That was a bizarre kind of thing. My aunt, who knew I just started taking pictures, and she sent me this subscription to Art Forum when I got to Vietnam, but that was my reading material. Every month I would get it, and so it's a strange thing because Art Forum, I don't know if that many people read Art Forum these days, but for me it was really tapping into not just photography, but it was just art in general, and different cities, whether it was Minneapolis or New York or San Francisco, LA, but places where there were reviews of shows and artists, names of artists I didn't know anything about. But later, obviously, when I got back to LA, I became involved in terms of going to museums and things like that.
So we're going to start out with some of your earliest pictures that we're looking at on the screen. Pictures taken in Santa Monica around 1970. And can you tell us how you came to be interested in this subject and why you photographed them in this particular way?
Well, these are the very first, actually they started in 1969. And if you know what Weston's pictures, like this picture here, I wanted to make pictures because of Weston. In other words, if you look at that back, the Weston's picture, that sand, now that sand is very, very even, very beautiful. And go back to my pictures. Now, it's still sand, but it's rough. And it's Santa Monica, it's Venice, different beaches. But one of the reasons I wanted to start photographing, or let's just say it happened, the very first picture, it's not here. There are 22 pictures in this series, which was the very first body of work. But when I was a kid, my family we used to go to Long Beach. Long Beach was like, it had a park. It was called, think of Coney Island. So a small Coney Island, but in LA, Long Beach. So we used to go there as a kid to the beach and this amusement park. So when I started in 1969, I would go there because at that point, there's this huge, huge area of sand, beach. But what happens is, if you went there on a Sunday, there would be very few people because it's so large. So I would be walking, and then I would just like see a few people laying down in the sand, like this couple here I'm looking at, that would be the one on the left. They were just, that's Santa Monica, and Santa Monica, if you've been to Santa Monica, it's also a very huge area of sand. So you're walking, there's nobody around, all of a sudden, there are these two people laying there, sunbathing, with their clothes on. And I would just walk past, take that picture, and then picture next to them. This is a different time, but same place, Santa Monica, but a different area. And there's this, it's a little deceiving, this picture on the right here, because it looks like he's really close to this woman, but he's actually not that close to her. It's the angle of the sand and this, my lens, 35 millimeter lens, it's a little deceiving. It makes her look like she's close to him, but she's actually further away. Because actually, if you see what he's doing with the sand, he's looking at her, you know, and it's very strange. But that's another thing I just ran in. In other words, I'm walking, and that's what's happening there. And so there are 22 pictures in this series. Only recently I've published a book of all these beach pictures, was what I call them. But these were the first real body of work as a series, you might say, that I collected and worked with.
And they were made in part as a reaction to this picture.
Yeah, and being inspired by this. And this particular picture, what really, when I see this picture, I always look at one thing. I mean, not completely one thing, but one thing always grabs me. You see the line right in the middle, that turn of skin, that little tension. That's the only tension you see right there in her body. But it's so powerful, even though it's a still photograph, a nude, that little edge, you might say, I don't know why, but to me, that's like where my eye always goes to, and I can feel that tension, which I really like. And Weston, by the way, if you don't know, he made a series of these nudes, and I think there's 6, right?
On the dunes.
Yeah, on the dunes. So there's 6 nudes, and they're really quite beautiful if you see them together as a group.
Yeah, he made these pictures in 1936. They're of his wife, Karis, and each one of them, she's a different form on the beach. You can see him really looking at her as a shape, and thinking in a very classical modernist way about the sort of tonalities of her skin against the sand.
And they're all good, by the way.
They're
all good pictures. 6 of them. Yeah. Okay.
So you also made street pictures in the 1970s. This is Los Angeles #2 from 1970. Can you tell us a little bit, give us a little bit of background about going to New York in 1970, perhaps meeting Gary Winogrand and Deanne Arbus, who were photographers who had been in an important exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art, and their influence on your direction moving forward?
Well, when I started, you might say, taking street photographs, downtown LA is a place, as a kid, I knew LA downtown. When we used to go to the theater, see films, hang out. So when I picked up a camera, I thought, where am I going to take pictures? So I ended up taking pictures in downtown LA because it's a place I knew. It wasn't the history of street photography. I met Gary later, really, and to me it was just something I knew, and that's the place I started. Later I did meet Gary Winogrand, Diane Arbus, a few other people, and that was, you might say, the beginning of this engagement in the street. And the way I thought about taking pictures in downtown LA and other places is that you're always walking. You're just, and the camera, by the way, you can hold in your hand. And when you see something, or you think you see something coming up, you bring it up to your eye and take a picture, and then you're walking past whatever that scene was. So I always thought of it as a dance in this particular space, whether it's New Orleans or it's LA or Waikiki or Madrid or London. That flow is what I was interested in, that kind of fluid way of working, which is very, very, very quick, and
Intuitive.
very intuitive. But the different ways that people, when I started looking at like Gary's picture here, and I met Gary Winogrand in New York. It's very different because what I wanted to do, thinking about the photographs from other photographers, I wanted to narrow it down, and I wanted to get closer to people, but I also wanted to try to be invisible. There is you might say, a history of photography where people are there are pictures being taken, but if you look at the pictures, like this particular picture of this woman, I'm standing right in front of her. If you look at her eyes, she's not looking at me, but I'm right there. So I'm like invisible. And now it doesn't work all the time, but those are the kinds of pictures I was trying to make. But on the other hand, there are other pictures where you are very close to somebody, but it's very confrontational. But anyway, the way I photograph this is very different than the way Gary photographed his picture, because what I wanted to do is, and Gary's working with a very wide-angle lens, 28mm wide-angle lens. I'm working with a 35mm lens, not as wide, and I always wanted to try to keep the distortion down, because to me, when you see a picture that has this distortion, that's the first thing you see. And I didn't want that to get in the way, so to speak. So everything I tried to photograph in other places, not just in LA, was always trying to look at things very straightforward this way.
Yeah, you can see this picture by Gary Winogrand from Women Are Beautiful was actually made in 1972. You can see the tilt in the angle of the picture that you can sort of tell he's walking. There's a motion in it, whereas you have really captured her straight on in a much more still way. But I think there's also something to talk about with how you approach Los Angeles as a subject and the people and places in Los Angeles as a subject. You've said, I try to be open and face the city. To me, it's not unpleasant or unbeautiful. It's just life, which has to be threatening sometimes if it's going to be interesting. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the subjects you choose and your definition of beauty or of ordinary.
Well, I think that people have asked me for certain why, this subject matter or that, and even the street photographs, whether it's LA or other cities, that's kind of hard to pin down. In other words, you can't put your finger on it, because when you're walking down the street, what are you attracted to? Well, I was attracted to that, or I was attracted to whatever it was. It wasn't like you ahead of time you thought, well, I'm going to be looking for this. That doesn't happen that way. It's just an intuitive thing. Whether it's a moment, you could see that somebody's coming. Maybe they're looking down at the ground, and whatever they're thinking about, and you're passing by them, whoever that person was and you took a picture. Well, I was attracted to that, but why? That's hard to, I don't know why. It's just that something that, the only other way I could try to pin it down is saying, I wanted to try to look at, because most of the cities they have hard surfaces, they're hard places to actually be walking in. So I wanted to take a really hard look at that. And thinking about other photographers, you might say, I thought, well, they weren't taking a really hard look at it. I mean, certain photographers were, Gary Winogrand, Robert Frank, other people, but maybe even in a more, if I can use the word, a poetic way or a softer way, or, I wasn't interested in that. I wanted something harder. Mm-hmm. And that's what I was attracted to. But the pictures themselves, in terms of those pictures, well, those are the pictures I just made.
Yeah. The sort of real life on the streets of Los
Yeah.
Angeles.
Yeah.
So one of the other things I wanted to talk about is how some of the photographs in this exhibition really came about because of the exhibition.
Yes.
That this is actually a series of pictures that you hadn't printed until you started working on the exhibition with SF MoMA. Do you want to tell the audience a little bit about how that came to be?
Well, because of the retrospective and having to, look at, my negatives, look at all the stuff I never really went back to look at. In other words, I had all these pictures, I had all these negatives, all these prints, but to start organizing it, that was a whole different thing. And so these negatives, I had taken these negatives in 1971. I had never proofed them. I had them in a sleeve. I found them years later, and I printed them. I didn't print them myself. These were printed later digitally. My printer did these. But I found them, and I completely forgot that I had made them. But it was only when during the retrospective that I said, wow, this is great. But, so things like that happened. And in the book, by the way, there are a number of pictures that are in the book that are not in the show. And so there are other places where I found a picture that I had never printed. It was a really good picture, so we could put it in the book, and it was printed later, but not printed by me at the time. But that was the thing about going through your archive, if I can put it that way, of discovering stuff that I had made but never printed. It was great, actually.
The thing I really like about this work is that it suggests so much about the act of photography, that when you enter the exhibition, you're really entering into Tony's world, and you're going to see the city through his eyes, and that you could step through any one of these doorways and see a different perspective. And so I love that being the entryway to the exhibition.
Yes,
and it suggests this sort of transitional space.
By the way, this is a bar restaurant and in downtown LA. It's not there anymore. It was torn down. But my wife asked me when I first made these pictures, when they were printed later, she said, well, how much time did you spend there? I said, 10 minutes maybe. She said, you're kidding. I said, no, I was just standing there waiting for people to come out. And then I just left. And she asked me, did anybody say anything? I said, nobody ever asked me. Nobody said anything. They just came out, and it's bright sunlight, and somebody maybe somebody thought, did somebody take my picture? They didn't ask. They just left. And so these were printed much later. The interesting question that came up, because it was a small book published of these pictures, but so somebody asked me, a curator, I forgot who it was, he said, did you see the doors, because the book actually has the doors closed with nobody. And so the question was, and that was the cover of the book, and then you open the book and these pictures were in there. So the question was, did you photograph the doors because you liked the way the light fell on the doors, and then somebody came out and you started taking pictures of the people? I said, well, I don't know. I have to ask my printer because he had all the negatives. So I said, where did you find that negative with the doors that closed? He said, oh, it's in the middle. So I said, strange. Yeah, different. Yeah.
So up until 1978, you were working primarily with 35 millimeter camera,
Right.
which is very easy, portable. You can sort of hide it. You can use it very quickly. Do you want to talk a little bit about why in 1978 you switched to a 5x7 Deerdorf camera? Tell people a little bit about that transition and what that means to use a camera of that size.
Well, I was working with 35 millimeter until 1976 with fast film, photographing people. And then I wanted to make a different kind of picture of what I call these automotive landscapes. There are a few in the show. And so I switched to very slow film, and I started photographing that. But then I wasn't happy with the results, the technical results of the prints. So I wanted to make a bigger print, finer quality, detail. So I got an NEA grant in 1978, and I bought a 5x7 Deerdorf, which is that format. And I continued with the automotive theme, and I wanted to keep it the same format from the 35. But what happened is I started photographing this 5x7 with a tripod, and it took me a little while to get going on that. But what happened is that that way of working, which is very slow with this tripod, I ended up becoming really. What I wanted to do is I wanted to continue this idea of the way I used to photograph with the 35 millimeter. I wanted to photograph it still in a very fluid way. So after time, I could, like this picture here, I could walk and see whatever's happening, and I could take a picture, believe it or not, in a minute. Even with a tripod and a 5x7 holder, you have to put the cloth over the camera, but I could take a picture in a minute because I got really good at it. And that was really the thrilling part of making these kinds of pictures, that you're walking through a city, you see somebody at a bus stop, you put your camera down, you take a picture, and then you continue walking to the next bus stop. If there's somebody there you want to photograph, if not, you just keep going. And at the end of the day, maybe you take a bus back wherever you started. So and then these pictures, these 5x7 pictures, this way of working, it's like you're looking at this, and then you saw something at the edge of your periphery, your eye, and when you stop photographing these bus stops, you started photographing people on their lunch hour. And so one body of work, another body of work, but it was all about the city of LA. And what I was interested in these bus stop pictures is, and then by the way, there are a lot of these pictures. There are some in the show and there's some in the book, but there are a lot more pictures of these bus stop pictures. Anyway, the idea was I wanted to make the same picture over and over again. It is the same picture over and over again, but they're all different, which was really what I liked about that kind of way of working. And what I also liked about it is that it gave you a way of looking at LA, whatever that was, the backdrop, you might say, the city itself, wherever it was, you could see that. And that's what intrigued me.
So around this time, you made 4 interrelated bodies of photographs between 1978 and 1982. This is one of them. It started with Automotive Landscapes, which you'll see downstairs. These are the public transit areas, public use areas, and public fishing areas. And they all examine these places that, as Tony said, they kind of hide in plain sight. So when we think of Los Angeles, you think of car culture, but you don't really think of people taking the bus. And there's a great quote in Erin O'Toole's essay in the catalog where she's quoting Tom Anderson, the director of Los Angeles Plays Itself, a documentary from 2003, who said, quote, "Who knows the city? Only those who walk, only those who ride the bus. Forget the mystical blatherings of Joan Didion and company about the automobile and the freeways. They say nobody walks. They mean no rich white people walk. They claim nobody takes the bus until one day we all discovered that Los Angeles has the most crowded buses in the United States." And so there is something interesting about the fact that you're really looking at the real Los Angeles,
Right.
at the places where working class and sort of ordinary people spend their days trying to get from one place to the next, whether
Right.
they're sort of getting their car fixed or whether they're waiting for the bus or on their lunch break. But there's still this element, this sort of formal element of perspective and pattern, and you have these 6 guys who are all sort of wearing the same outfit, kind of looking at you.
Right.
So all of these things, these patterns, both social, political patterns
Right.
and formal patterns are coming together in this work.
Yeah, by the way, this is the very first bus stop picture I made, and it's not very far from where I live now, in an apartment in LA. But that was the first one. It was kind of it's happened before too. Not a, I mean, in some bodies of work, the very first picture is a really good picture. I mean, it's like really strong. And I've done that a number of times, so it's like you start with that and you go, wow. So it kind of drives you. Think, wow, I can make more
So
of it.
so is making the really strong picture the thing that impels you to continue a project?
Yeah, and it's happened a number of times.
Mhm.
You know, not just for the black and white, but for color. I did a book on the LA River. The very first picture there was great, and it just did the book. You know, it just happens that way.
I really like the man standing under the air conditioner. It's
Yes.
almost like, there's no shade and there's no respite from the elements, and so he's sort of crouched under the air conditioner.
Yeah, yeah. No, the whole idea is that the whole edge of so all these pictures, whether 35 millimeter or this bus stop pictures, they're not cropped. This is all the full negative. There's nothing ever cropped. It's just the way you saw it, or I saw it, the way I framed it very quickly. And the only thing you couldn't control is obviously there's a traffic going by, and it's a very slow shutter speed, so you can see there's a movement there, but that's okay.
So you were taking the bus around when you were making these pictures.
And I was walking too.
And you were walking. And one of the things we talked about earlier was that, and I love this idea that, you can make these pictures with a 5x7 camera so quickly because, you're walking and you see something and you make a picture and you keep going. And I love this sort of fluidity you talk about with pictures that look so still. So this is a public use area, number 25 from 1980. And do you want to tell us a little bit about what we're looking at here and what compelled you to make this picture?
Well, so I was interested in how people use the city in terms of like their lunch hour. Where do they sit? What are they doing? Reading a book, eating, and different places in LA. This is Century City. And so again, it may look like I'm there all day trying to set this picture up, waiting for somebody maybe to come and sit there. But I'm not, actually. Century City is a big, mall, and I'm walking with my camera like I was taking a picture of a bus stop, but now it's changed to this big complex. So this woman was there reading her book, and I just stopped, made that picture, and kept walking. So it's not like I've spent any time thinking about what I'm looking at. I'm just working and taking pictures. The interesting thing about this picture now is back then, you could photograph in that area with a tripod. There was no security or anything like that. Now you can't photograph anything like that because if you're on the tripod, security come out and say you can't photograph here. You can photograph if you have a 35 millimeter camera or something like that. So it's changed in terms of I couldn't make that same picture now at all, But I love it that she is her back. So if you're thinking about that middle, it's split, So in terms of seeing this, very intuitively, maybe I felt that, and then I took that picture. But it wasn't like at the moment thinking, oh, this is what I'm interested in. You just react to it, took the picture.
It's like the part of her that's reclining in the grass is in a different city than the part of her that's sitting
right in the front of her, and then
in front of the bank.
And then she's got her feet there like that. Yeah. It's wonderful. It's like sculpture. Yeah.
So in 1984, you transitioned again, but this time to color from black and white. And this is also this is a series called Rodeo Drive. That's different in that it isn't looking primarily at the working class, that it is a much more sort of affluent subject group. But these are really fun pictures that I hope you will go down and look at more closely. But why the change to color, and why were you interested in this more
Well,
consumer-focused group?
This is a good story. The bus stop pictures, I'll try to make it short. The bus stop pictures were going to be published in a magazine called LA Magazine. I got a call from the art director and said he got my name from Robert Heineken. They were going to do an issue on 5 or 6 LA photographers. And these other photographers in LA all had galleries. They were teaching. I did not teach. I didn't have a gallery. But Heineken knew I was out photographing. So he said, they contacted me, and I showed him my bus pictures. And he said, oh, we're going to publish some of these with Heineken and Joan Callis and John DeVola, other photographers in LA. And we're going to pay you to publish your own pictures. And I thought that was really great. I was going to be in this magazine. Well, it turns out that the director above him didn't want to publish the pictures. And so he called me and said, I'm sorry, but we're not going to use pictures. I said, well, what happened? He said, well, the director, he didn't want to use them because they thought they were too depressing for LA, people waiting for the bus. So anyway, what happened is he felt really bad about it. So he said, listen, I know you don't do any commercial work, but I'd like to try to help you, give you something because of what happened. And I said, well, maybe this is a good opportunity that I could try to do some, because I had not done any kind of commercial work. So I said, maybe this is a good time to think about doing something like that. I said, but I'll keep it separate. I'll keep my black and white. I'll take some color pictures and go and show them something and do some commercial color work. And I thought that was a good idea. So I went out to try to make some color pictures, which was not so easy. And anyway, I ended up going to Rodeo Drive, thinking, well, I should go there because I've never really hung out in Rodeo Drive, Beverly Hills, trying to make color pictures. And I did. And so what happened, one of the pictures is in the show here, and I made this terrific color picture, and I was really thrilled by it. So I switched. Now I was just making color pictures, and I never thought about that guy. I never thought about the magazine. I never called him. It was just like, it was a big shift. So it was kind of like a gift, and that's great. Yeah, and this is a book that was published, by the way. It's called Rodeo Drive, 1984. So that worked out.
So we're shifting again, in between 1989, 1992 or so. You made this body of work, Landscapes for the Homeless, and there are no longer people in the photographs, but instead you see what people have left behind in the landscape. So do you want to tell us what made you interested in looking at homeless encampments and how you got access to some of these places?
Well, this body of work actually started in Las Vegas. I don't know if I mentioned that to you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I was photographing something else in Las Vegas, and if anybody's ever been to the desert in Las Vegas, sometimes the wind can blow for 3 days straight. And so that's what happened once when I was there trying to photograph, not this subject matter, it's something else. And so out of frustration, near the motel I was staying at, I had to take a walk. And I walked, and there was a bridge, under a bridge, in the back of this freeway bridge, in Las Vegas. I ran across a little homeless camp, and I made a few pictures. And then I continued what I was photographing there in Vegas, which was I call these shooting sites, places where people go and target practice, and I was photographing that. So 2 years later, when I finished what I was doing with these shooting site things, I found these few pictures I had made of this homeless camp. Back in LA, I started thinking, oh, there's a lot of this happening now, and I want to photograph the evidence of homelessness, not the people, not portraits, but just the evidence of homelessness. And like, for instance, this picture, the reason it's done in that way, these two pictures, So I have a a square format camera, so it's not a wide-angle lens, but that scene, the only way I could photograph it was take 2 shots of it, so to speak, and that's what you're looking at. But what's really interesting about this picture, my camera is actually on a mattress, and this is the right side of this mattress. These cigarettes are all on this right side. There's no cigarettes in front, and there's no cigarettes on the left side. All of this is on one side. So you imagine the homeless guy's there, he's smoking, but it's always throwing it that way. And this is a really funny story. I showed these pictures in a show in Japan, and there was a question and answer after, and this young Japanese man asked me 2 questions, or I wanted to know 2 things. He said, one, did I move anything in this picture? I said, no, I didn't move anything. And then he said, well, I didn't write it down, but he counted every cigarette in this picture. And I didn't write it down, though.
He had just as much a compulsion as the man who was smoking the cigarettes.
Can you imagine that?
No.
But the idea that I could move something, where would I start? Something like that. Anyway, so I was interested in looking at that kind of, you might say, reality of
Yeah.
homelessness in LA.
And this is around the time that homelessness was really becoming a crisis in Los Angeles.
88, starting there.
And you have actually compared these landscapes to a kind of war zone. And yet there's a kind of reverence in these pictures for the ingenuity of the people and the objects that they're taking such good care of. I mean, every time I give a tour of the exhibition, I say that this is like a picture that could be in our European galleries, like a still life from the 17th century. You've got the belt that almost looks like it's becoming a snake.
Right.
The apple that's on this little dining room table. The pencil sharpener, the razors, all of these objects that are being so carefully cared for. And then, Tony, you told me this story about what that little object is in the middle, the socket thing for getting water.
Oh, yeah. It's just like a little connection. Because homeless, it's different now, but then homeless people are very, if you think about it, you can get water, electricity, lots of things if you know how to do it. And the city, that's the problem, because homeless people tap into a lot of things and the city has to try to, stop them. But now, actually, in LA, you may not know this, but homelessness now is worse than it was when I was making these pictures. It's so crazy that it's like, you might say it's doubled. The amount of people, it's doubled. And the city is overwhelmed that actually, I don't know how they can deal with it, because it's just out of control. It's just really too much. I'm not photographing this anymore, but I did another book called Forever, which is a different way of looking at these homeless sites. And the reason I called it Forever is because I could keep photographing this kind of thing forever, when you really think about it.
It's a social ill that has never seen any kind of change or abatement, really.
Right.
So after Landscapes for the Homeless, you began making pictures, not just in Los Angeles, but in cities like Baltimore, Oakland. These are 2 pictures from Rome. This is Pictures for Rome 22 and Pictures for Rome 17, both from 1999. And there's a transition that happens here where you're not really as aware of the presence of people, but instead you get a sense of your interest in color, pattern, found sculpture. So do you want to talk a little bit about what we're looking at in these pictures?
Well, I did a book when I was later, after I left Rome, which was about a year. It's a Rome fellowship. So I started photographing you might say, not the old ruins of Rome, but these new ruins of Rome, meaning a lot of buildings that were started, for instance, that were never finished. So, for instance, there were a big complex of buildings, but maybe who knows how it happened, but all these buildings, they must have hit a spring or something because they're all there's that much water under all these buildings. So they stopped. They didn't fix it. And so this complex is just left there. It's been there for 15 years. So I started photographing these different buildings that were all on the periphery of Rome. And some of these buildings that are not underwater, that were just abandoned buildings, some homeless people were camped out in there. So this one with the string is really a string that was holding a laundry. That's in one building. The other is you're looking up at a unfinished elevator shaft. So you're looking straight up. I'm in the bottom of that elevator shaft, photographing it, looking up. And these buildings, that's another complex that for some reason were abandoned. But those were all around Rome. And I did this book which is really about these spaces, which is really great. Interesting.
So just like the picture we were just looking at here of the elevator shaft, there is this interest I see in your work of apertures and of perspective and the way you use either shape or color to kind of move the shapes forward or backward in the picture in the depth of the field of the photograph. These are two pictures from a series called Everything. And why is the series titled Everything?
Well, this is a book I did about the LA rivers. So the reason I called it Everything is everything ends up in the LA River. And and when I photographed all these pictures, there are really, you can imagine, objects, pornography, everything. And the one on this side, the left, now I did these 10 drainages. In other words, these are drainages that all the water is coming back into the LA River. This other one with a bag is actually a homeless site under one of the bridges, and somebody has left their actually what's in that bag is medicine that they're left. That little card right there is from the city, and if you read it, I mean, I'm telling you, is that it's somebody who was homeless who had some medicine, and that's their bag, and that's something I found, but the light on that object, on that bag, to me, it's like this wonderful sculpture that's just floating there, And the other one of this drainage, if you look, you see a reflection. The reflection is like looking down of what's up above, but there's only about that much water. It's very deceiving. You think it's like, wow, it's only that much. So it's very ambiguous, you might say. But I really love that. And in the show, there's 9 of these drainages, but there are actually 10 pictures. There's one missing because we couldn't put them as a grid. But and some of them are printed larger later. But they're wonderful. By the way, also I had to mention, and if you see the ones in the show, some of the exposures on some of them are like 20, 25-minute exposures, which is a long exposure, which I like trying to make.
Like this one as well, because you're in such a dark space that you have to leave the shutter open in order for enough light to come in.
Yeah, this is like this is like a 25-minute exposure. And what it is, what you see here, all those, like you might say, scratches, they're all done with a nail. And what it is this guy named Eddie. The only reason I know his name was Eddie. I met another guy, his name is Percy, and he was living under this bridge since 1970, homeless guy who I met. And in this labyrinth, meaning it's a bridge that you can go quite a long ways underneath this bridge, at the very bottom, the edge of it, this other guy, Eddie, his bed is right here on the left side, that side. And he did all that over time. And when I was there, Percy told me he had left. He didn't know what happened to him. But all that was done by, he called him Crazy Eddie. And so I made that picture.
And this is from the body of work Forever that you had referenced earlier, where you're sort of standing or sitting where homeless people have their beds or chairs.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
we're looking at what the person would be looking at when they're kind of in their space. And there's an interesting sort of narrowing down in your work,
Right.
where from Landscapes for the Homeless, you're sort of farther away. You're looking at
This is a detail, yeah,
yes,
like
you
details.
get closer into the patterns the further we get into the exhibition.
And this was another book published, and they have some here at the bookstore, which is this body of work, which is called Forever.
And your wife, Judith Freeman, who's also a writer and a novelist, wrote the introduction to that
Yeah,
book.
it's a good piece.
So this is also a picture from the series Forever from 2007. And then on the right, we are looking at William Henry Fox Talbot's The Open Door, made before May 1844. And this picture on the right was a picture that was made, it was a picture Talbot made, which was an attempt to photograph in accord with the renewed British taste for Dutch genre painting of the 17th century. And I find it interesting because you are interested in elevating the ordinary and the everyday in sort of the same way, so finding these moments. But I also wanted to show this to sort of ask you to talk a little bit about your interest in the history of photography and how that has influenced you.
Well, for instance, the broom, yes, there's obviously you make the connection, but the cardboard, I'm a big fan of Rauschenberg. Rauschenberg used cardboard in a really great way. So there's a layer here. It's not just photography, it's art. Rauschenberg, other artists have used cardboard, but then when you think about the broom itself, I mean, as sculpture, there's references to lots of different people using objects. And so to me, it's you might say, when I was looking at some of these sites, particularly like something like this, you might say it's the most ordinary stuff, really. You can't think of, I mean, it's just a wall, cardboard, this child's broom, the most ordinary things. But the photograph of that stuff is not ordinary. And that's the idea for me, to make a picture of this ordinary stuff. But the picture is really, I don't want to use my own word, great, but it's a really good picture. It works, it's strong. And of this ordinary stuff.
So there's a kind of alchemy that happens where through photographing it, you transform it, you elevate it.
Right.
And you know, there are a lot of pictures in the exhibition that are very, I mean, a lot of the pictures we've looked at here, just the string in that room, become a kind of sort of glowing object.
Yeah, and then the other thing is that some of these places that I made, there are lots of places in the southeast side of downtown LA. So it's really like these poor neighborhoods from South Central, Compton, Watts, at the edge of downtown. So I made all these pictures in these areas where most people would think there's really nothing there. But when I think about it, it's really rich in a lot of different ways, but you really have to go out and discover what's there. And to me, like the pictures of thing in the LA River, well, if you're looking at the LA River from a distance or on a bridge, it just looks like there's nothing there, just a slab of concrete and a little bit of a river in the middle, like a ribbon. But if you're actually walking in that space, and I walked the LA River a number of times, which is about 17 miles, you find things, but you won't find them unless you go out there and look for them, discover them, so to speak.
And this is a picture you discovered in the desert outside of Los Angeles.
Near the Salton Sea, yeah. Again, these are from a book called Discarded. And what it is there are a lot of these new subdivisions that were being built in and around the desert communities in Southern California. And I found a number of them that were just started, whatever happened, it went belly up, and then people would come in and try to steal whatever they could steal, and pretty soon some homeless people might try to live in some of these abandoned places. So there are all these kind of ways of for me, again, discovering, even out in these desert communities, maybe I had never been there before. So I'm out looking, and then I find something, and then I ask somebody, well, how long has this been here? They say, oh, it's been here 5 years, it's been here 10 years. What happened? Nobody knows. They just stopped. But so I ended up doing this book about these places called Discarded in Southern California.
And this is our last slide. It's also your most recent work. These are Against LA's number 1 and 2 from 2017, so made this year.
Right.
And I mean, I like to always ask the audience what you think you're looking at when you see these pictures. A screen? Anyone else? All right, Tony, you're going to have to tell them.
It is I'm back to a bus stop, the actual bus stop. In other words, a bus stop has a bench, a metal screen with holes in it, a cover, and now I'm photographing the metal screen. That's in focus, and whatever's in back of that screen is slightly out of focus, and that's what this work is. And this is just two from a different body of work, which I'm still working on now.
But it's really interesting to think about the earlier bus stop pictures and how you were looking at people sitting there, and now you're using the bus stop itself
Right.
as a screen through which to look at the city.
Right.
And the formal patterns that makes really ties a lot of the elements of your work together in a way that I think is really interesting, and it's especially interesting to see these pictures being made now.
Right, and I like the title Against LA. It's like against, like it's like the background or the backdrop. But again, it's to me, because if you think about it, I'm photographing all these different bus stops in LA. Not all of them are the same. In other words, if you went to West Hollywood, they have glass, so I can't photograph through glass. So I'm photographing, you might say, these older bus stops, which, by the way, I forgot to mention to you, some of these bus stops, I come to a bus stop and say, well, that's interesting, except the screen's gone because people steal the screens because they can recycle the metal, sell the metal. So that's the other thing that's happening. I can't photograph someone because they're gone. But I like the idea of again, making the same picture all over again in LA, but they're all different because you can't control what's behind that screen. But then sometimes people come in to these areas. I have other pictures like this, but they're all abstract. They don't have any people, but they're interesting.
In a way, your career has been sort of making a typology of the places of Los Angeles, but without enough clues to really tell anyone where you are. So it's kind of an abstracted version of the city, but also a more real version of the city because you're seeing what really exists there rather than a more glamorized version of it.
Yeah, and I like that it's ambiguous, and you have to maybe work a little bit when you're looking at these kinds of pictures. Mm-hmm. So it's not all that clear, which is part of the charm.